Hi, everyone. If you can please take a seat, we will start the session. My name is Aude Darnal. I am a research analyst at the Stimson Center, where I lead the Global South in the World Order project, which seeks to elevate geopolitical perspectives from Southern experts. I'm very pleased to be here with you today, and thank you to IDEAS and the Federal University of Rio for convening these events. And for this session now, we will discuss the thorny issue of dealing with explicit and implicit conditionalities. And with us today, we have three great speakers to tackle this issue. First of all, Alfredo Saad-Filho, who's professor at Queen's University, Belfast. He's a former senior economics affairs officer at UNCTAD. Then we have Marina Zucker-Marques. She's a senior academic researcher in the Global Economic Governance Initiative and team leader for Financial Stability Workstream at the Boston University's Global Development Center. She's the co-chair of Brazil T20 Task Force 3, and she formerly worked in the Debt and Development Financial Branch at UNCTAD. And Ahilan Kadirgamar, he's a senior lecturer at the University of Jaffna in Sri Lanka and the chair of the North Cooperative Development Bank in Sri Lanka. Our speakers will have 15 minutes each, and we will then proceed with the Q&A session. Alfredo, please go ahead.
So, thanks very much for this absolutely wonderful conference. It's been a pleasure to be here. Now, conditionalities are justified along two lines. First, any credit union needs conditions to avoid moral hazard. Second, the assumption that capitalist economies tend towards full employment equilibrium, so macroeconomic disequilibrium must be caused by misguided policies, and their correction will have no adverse implications for domestic activity or employment. Quite the contrary, conditions should be good for you. Now, inevitably, in this framework, policy recommendations will be heavily concentrated on fiscal and monetary policy reforms because of the assumption that government misbehavior must have driven the domestic and external disequilibria, and then market reforms to roll back a presumably inefficient state and expand the scope for efficient market, private sector activity will be good. Now, paradoxically, the post-Washington consensus that was then presented as moderating those excesses of the orthodoxy and then would offer some positive guidelines for state intervention contradicting the traditional orthodoxy, the post-Washington consensus actually increased the range of conditionalities because of the emphasis of new institutional economics on lack of development being caused by misguided regulations, badly defined property rights, and a whole range of other institutional constraints, leading to an even longer list of conditions than the one that had originally been quite arrogantly synthesized by John Williamson. So the post-Washington consensus stressed that the role of the state should match its capabilities. So even if industrial policy could be effective, developing countries should not try it because it was too complicated for them, which was a way to recognize the successes of developmentalism in East Asia without making any concessions in practice. After the global financial crisis, the World Bank rushed to join the bandwagon through what they called inclusive growth, which had nothing to do with growth, much less with inclusion, and shockingly added even more conditionalities for the indebted developing countries. Now, these are experiments with the welfare of others with a track record across formal and informal conditionalities that is very mixed. What jumps out is that the IFIs criticize developing countries, for example, for picking winners through industrial policy, even though the IFIs have picked winners for decades when they provided easy loans for important US clients like Mexico, Argentina, Turkey, and Egypt, then claimed success until those countries crashed again when they were then abandoned. And then they picked winner when they sought sub-Saharan African success stories like Uganda and Ghana, but having no interest in those countries or no commitment to them beyond performativity. The IFIs also picked losers systematically, most shockingly perhaps Zambia, which misbehaved back in the 1980s and is being punished until now to teach a lesson to the other semi-colonies, not to get above themselves. Technically, the conditionalities follow from the IMF financial programming model, drawing on the quantity theory of money and the monetary approach to the balance of payments, so between the 18th century and the 1950s, with assumptions of fixed exchange rates, fixed exports, and no international capital movements, even though this is completely inappropriate for a neoliberal world economy of global value chains, large financial flows, and floating exchange rates. At the same time, the IFIs, IMF in particular, but the IFIs in general, proclaim the relentless advance of globalization, the impossibility of resisting it, the foolishness of capital controls, even though when the United States wants to punish its assigned enemies, it declares that financial sanctions are highly effective and will very soon break the other side. Of course, both statements are false. And in practice, the policies associated with conditionalities have tended to overestimate the costs of government intervention, to neglect the costs of adjustment, to expect miracles from the intangible notion of business confidence, to favor large capitals, to neglect externalities, to increase the influence of finance, to disarticulate value chains, to worsen the balance of payments constraint, to reduce policy-making capacity, to increase uncertainty and volatility, to reduce the scope for industrial policy, and then undermining the conditions for long-term success. In practice, unsurprisingly, that track record is poor, and of course, the policies followed by China, Japan, South Korea over their 30 years of rapid and sustained growth completely departed from the conventional rule book. Shorter success stories in Brazil, in Ethiopia, Vietnam, and so on also departed from the mainstream. Even the more recent success stories in Eastern Europe were skewed by EU subsidies and the restructuring of German capital that created wealth in new areas at the expense of economic growth and social cohesion in Germany itself. The IFIs are also obsessed with the notion that public investment will raise fiscal deficits and generate inflation, even though there's very little evidence that public investment crowds out private investment, or that inflation under 40% is harmful to growth, or that it damages the poor. And there's plenty of evidence that the obsession with low inflation can harm the poor. There's also evidence that public investment can reduce poverty, that the multiplier of fiscal policy is generally large, and that as long as fiscal deficits are used to expand aggregate supply, they may not be inflationary at all. Now, on top of this, there are the conditionalities for democracy, or the impact of conditionalities for democracy in the borrowing countries, which is something that economists don't discuss very much, but I think is super important. First, who sets the goals and the policies? Second, what are the implications of systematically disempowering developing country policymakers? Third, why is it that developing countries that now fund more than 80% of the cost of running the IMF continue to have zero influence on policy making, because the top positions and the policy advice are completely monopolized by the global north, despite their own track record of economic failure and their diminished role in the global economy? Why is it? And fourth, why is it that the international financial institutions never focused on the responsibilities of rich countries and large corporations, the cost of the conditionalities themselves, and the social consequences of their loans? And fifth, whose interests are served by imposing impractical policies with unrealistic targets that are almost never achieved, and doing this over and over again in the same country and in other countries? This is a farce. It's an absolute farce. Now, let me say something about alternative development strategies, based on notions of social inclusion and economic democracies. And these are alternative policies that have to draw, for theoretical reasons and reasons of experience, to draw on an active fiscal stance. They have to focus on public investment, not only to promote faster growth, but also to focus resources on poverty reduction. And in that case, monetary policy plays a complementary and accommodating role, and we ought to avoid inflation targeting regimes and central bank independence that are an absolute trap for developed countries, and developing countries even worse. Public investment needs to be financed by domestic resources instead of aid and external loans, because they feed dependence. We know from heterodox theories and from experience that financial institutions and external capital flows must be regulated, and that public financial institutions can direct credit to support growth and poverty reduction. And we know that trade liberalization and devaluations of the exchange rate do not promote export without the added contribution of industrial policy and the protection of strategic sectors and agriculture. Instead, most experiences of liberalization had a negative impact on manufacturing and agriculture in developing countries. They were pro-finance, pro-urban upper classes, and anti-poor. And across all these alternative priorities, the point is to focus growth on the rights and opportunities for the poor and the disadvantaged. Growth and distribution must come together as conditions for a democratic model of development. So, despite the rhetorical commitment to pro-poor growth in the mainstream literature, there's overwhelming evidence of inconsistency between orthodox stabilization-obsessed strategies and national poverty reduction strategies, with employment being often the missing link between the two, because those strategies generate stagnation and do not create jobs, much less skilled and well-paying jobs. It's also clear that national ownership is essential for more effective economic policy, and this does not require external agencies to suspend judgment entirely, but it does imply that judgment has to come from conceptual openness and genuine interactions with national stakeholders that we don't find in practice. It would also help if the donors and the lenders recognized their own mistakes over 40 years, some of which is amply documented in their own in-house evaluations that are then systematically buried away time and again. So to summarize, the reforms have been partial and uneven. Institutional development and inflation control have strengthened important areas of the economy in many developing countries, but conventional policies and conditionalities have also tended to generate feeble and unstable growth, except under global commodity booms that have nothing to do with conditionalities, and speculative cycles that do, but in a destabilizing way. So in most poor countries, as we have discussed in this conference, the internal market remains unable to drive a supply response to address structural weaknesses, and this is largely the fault of conditionalities that stress policy reforms as ends in themselves instead of focusing on structural change, growth, distribution, and improving the conditions of the poor. Policy ownership and good governance should be about the ability to select the most appropriate policies in the light of national interest and control over projects, budgets, and modes of delivery. And this is what is missing. This is what is unforgivable. This is also why conditionalities must be challenged in a coming period on the basis of greater respect for the global south and greater equality between countries, which means, of course, and I'll finish on this, challenging the global arrangement through a different power relation between North and South. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alfredo, for those very bold comments. Marina, please go ahead and for another 15 minutes.
Thank you. I have a PowerPoint. Just wait a minute. So today I'm going to talk a little bit on the case of IMF conditionality in Kenya and show a little bit how not only the conditionalities apply applied caused social and political instability in the country, but also economically they were the wrong policy package. This is something that is obviously very obvious to this audience. So maybe let's see this presentation as an illustrative example of what we've been discussing until today. I will start by showing a little bit of the background of the debt and development crisis. Then I go to the case of Kenya, and then a summary how I see, from an inside perspective, what should be changed. I will not make comments. I completely agree that we should have, no conditionalities at all. When the IMF was initially created, the idea was not to have conditionalities, in the perspective of the US and UK back then, but the conditionalities were applied to developing countries. I will not get into the broader reform, but what, in the specific, what could be changed. So just starting by the background, I think can be a little bit odd for, a Brazilian economist that works in the US. What am I talking about Kenya? So what is the context of this? So we've been working in a project, Debt Relief for Green Inclusive Recovery, which was a project done with colleagues from Soils University of London and HBS in Germany, looking to what are the possibilities of the debt relief and low-income countries specifically. Our key focus is that developing countries need a very huge push investments, and this is urgent. It's urgent first because the SDGs are completely off of track. Only 15% of the SDGs are on track. The rest are delayed or completely off. We really need an investment push because climate change, if you do not invest it now, the cost of inaction is going to be huge. So it's urgent to invest. However, many developing countries, they do not have the fiscal space to do it. The fiscal space is very thin or no fiscal space at all. With it, I won't get into the details. I already presented in Amherst this work. We tweaked that sustainability analysis for low-income countries, which is a tool used by the IMF and the World Bank, but to assess that sustainability of developing countries. But this tool, as it is now, does not consider the investments in climate needs. So what we did, we tweaked the DSA to see to what extent countries can invest in development and climate without breaching that sustainability analysis. And we see that out of the 66 countries that are in the LICS DSA, 47 would breach sustainability thresholds, showing that, to have fiscal space, a debt reduction would be needed. And I must say, we were very, light with the model. We assume actually lower interest rates that it's now. We assume a green, we assume that the investments are actually going to generate higher growth. But even though, because developing countries, they import a lot and they will go, the debt is going to grow higher than the growth. That's why that the relief now is important to allow them to invest. So this is in the context. But and we found in our study that Kenya was one of the cases that they would need to receive that relief. But the narrative from the IMF and global policymakers is that Kenya is a case that we need refinancing rather than debt relief. And this is something that came up, for instance, from the US approach to debt. So during the spring meetings this year, the US Treasury has revealed their US vision on debt, would basically, an approach to have net positive flows for developing countries without debt relief, and which I must say there are some positive sides on their approach, but it's not as ambitious given the climate investments that we need to push. And then in May, President Ruto visited the US, and they revealed the Nairobi-Washington vision that was basically applying this US vision on debt for the case of Kenya. The thing is, 1 month later, the huge protests emerged in Kenya. They burned the parliament. 61 people died related to this because and they were protesting against the tax increases in the country, which was connected to policy recommendations from the IMF. So, and this is also true when we look to the IMF program. When you look to the IMF program, when you read the Article 4, that is a narrative that is actually a liquidity pressure. And at some extent, this is true, but it's not only the liquidity pressure that Kenya is facing. So that is an approach that Kenya's debt is sustainable, although they've been refinancing themselves for over 10% per year, which is actually building further the debt crisis in the country. So, I know I don't have much time. I will try to go very quickly what I see the key macroeconomic issues in Kenya in light of development challenges that they have. So, although the narrative of the case of Kenya has been that Kenya, irresponsible fiscal policies where they have, recurrent fiscal deficit, and that's what led to the current situation. If you see from a developmental perspective, what have been happening in the last 10 years is that Kenya has been in an investment push for development, where the government has been investing in infrastructure, a very fast growth with last 10 years of about 4% per year, which is higher than the continent's average. And this, with increasing of a middle income class that imports a lot, so a lot of imports for capital goods, imports of goods because people are increasing their income, and this has led to a current deficit, a structural deficit in the current account, like over 5% of the GDP in the last 10 years, and this is not what I used to say. What I say is that, even if we know that all countries and policymaking, there are mistakes as well. But if you, haven't sent Kenya all the perfect policymakers in the world, they will still have problems in the balance of payments just because their economic structure doesn't allow them to have a more balanced approach. So here I'm showing Kenya's share of the product goods and the export and import bundle. So they import a lot of capital goods. They don't export as much capital goods, which has higher value added, and they export coffee, cocoa. So it's basically, an imbalance. Yeah, the same as we know, common to many developing countries. And this has led to a structural current account deficit. Can I go back? Yeah. And not surprisingly, this has led to an accumulation of the external liabilities. So, which is now So it's now reached 9% of the GDP in external liabilities, which has increased over time. And this is, the external assets has not increased as much. So as a result, with this accumulation of external liabilities, when we have the COVID increase in interest rate in the global north, was basically that the nominal exchange rate in Kenya devaluated. This was with conjunction with tightening domestic monetary policies, and not surprisingly, you have a huge impact of the debt service payments in the budget. So today, about 5% of Kenya's GDP is only to serve interest rate. It's not only debt repayments, it's only interest rate. So then the question is, of course, I will get into there. There is a question that in the next years, there is a huge repayment of the principal, but it's not about only the repayment of the principal, right? It's the interest rate and the needs to push new investments. So now the question is, and I will try to do as quickly as possible, does the IMF programs address any of these questions that the Kenya economy has and its structural problems? The short answer is no. First, IMF recommended the privatization of state-owned enterprises. 5 of them are profitable. You're not going to solve your balance of payment, your current account deficits selling domestic companies, selling an asset is not going to solve, especially if you sell to locals, which is probably some groups will do. The second question is, can fiscal austerity correct capital account imbalances? We know that no. This is actually a paper by IMF staff that they mentioned that when the current account is huge, the current account deficit is so huge, there is no way you're going to balance this with fiscal austerity. So it's not me saying, it's IMF staff. They know this already. The second question is, the fiscal austerity and monetary tightening in the last years in Kenya has reduced the growth of the manufacturing sector, which should be, the one employing more people, helping in the structural transformation. So agricultural goods are increasing, but the manufacturing sector is just stagnant. Now we go to also the focus of the IMF on primary balances. So the whole IMF program was pushing Kenya to do primary deficits surpluses. But why primary balances and not looking to the overall government borrowing needs? The question is, when we look, because the interest rate is increasing so much, even if you tie your belts and reduce primary balances, you continue to have problems. You do not stabilize your debt to GDP ratio, because interest rates, you have to borrow just to pay interest rates. That's what's happening. And that's why despite the deficits in the correction of the primary balance deficit, Kenya has increased the volume of debt to GDP. And finally, I have one more point, and then I'm going to the conclusion. So sorry, I know it's going to do a sound, so I'm almost there. I think a huge question, and we go back to what I said at the beginning about the refinancing approach from the IMF. I think the huge mistake here is that they are looking only to the tip of the iceberg. So the argument has been, okay, we need to borrow more because you are going to have, payments. You have to serve your payments in the next coming years. That's why you have to borrow, even if that is expensive. But you're looking just to that service, and that's not the complete payments that you have to do from your balance self-payment size. You need to refinance. You need to pay your short-term loans. You need to finance your current account deficit. So even if you find money to refinance your debt obligations, who is going to finance your current account in short term? So we need to look to all the external obligations, not only to the refinancing. Second, we need to look to the investment needs in climate investment. So it's estimated that Kenya needs to invest 6% of their GDP only to finance the national determined climate contributions. So on top of this they already have to finance more. So, and this also goes to refinancing. If refinancing is not possible and refinancing is small, you need more haircut to put the country back on their feet. And then finally, it goes to the question of the size of the international financial system. The question is, the IMF and the World Bank and others, they are not in the adequate size to address Kenya's problem. So Kenya's program now is almost 500% of their quota. The World Bank, they're going to finance 1.2 billion, which is not much compared to what they have to finance externally. So the system is not, we are just looking to the tip of the iceberg when you look to refinancing and not looking to what is needed. So last slides just to conclude. So what has to be changed? First, we need a better diagnosis of the debt problem. We need to look to considering development changes. We need to look to the balance of payment constraints, which the IMF is focused on domestic fiscal policies. We need to acknowledge, the characteristics of the system. So the private sector and the private lenders, they are not going to refinance, willing to refinance. Like lions eat meat, they are going to be countercyclical. It's their nature. So we need a better system, a larger system to address a countercyclical larger sector. This goes to, we need the deeper haircut with more countries. We need a bigger IMF with more quotas, and we need a bigger MDB system. And finally, we need to adjust the programs. We need a growth enhancing program that is country-led and not IMF-led. We need industrial policy. We need increase in self-sufficient of countries and also increase the exports. But this is also a question of cooperation among countries. So I will finish here, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marina. And our last speaker for the session, Ahilan, please go ahead for your presentation.
Thanks to IDEAS and the Federal University of Rio for inviting me. I have a PowerPoint, but I'm not going to take too much time through it, and I kind of want to also reflect a bit on what's been discussed the last 2 days. So I've been asked to speak about explicit and implicit conditionalities. And so I'll kind of ground it a little bit in the case of Sri Lanka. But then what I hope to do is, maybe talk about the kind of either the implicit or explicit logic of financialization, which is, I think, at the core of this, and then to think in terms of an alternative of self-sufficiency. So for those of you who haven't been following the crisis in Sri Lanka, this is probably the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The contraction, the huge rise in poverty. So the crisis is just unprecedented. But I kind of draw the path towards this crisis where Sri Lanka was the first country in South Asia to liberalize its economy in the late 1970s. So that the process had started, but then we went through this long civil war. So the neoliberal policies did not go as fast as they could. It's at the end of the civil war that I would say that a second wave of neoliberalism, which coincided with the global financial crisis, so a kind of a supply side push of capital, that saw us, like in Zambia, like in Ghana, around the same time that we started, commercial borrowing became the main form of international financing. But what really kind of pushed us over the cliff, so to speak, was the COVID crisis and then the war in Ukraine. So we went through a 26-year-long civil war when we did not default. It was boom times, which then got us to default. So kind of to look at the kind of political and sort of policy timeline, as I mentioned, it's we've had from May 2009, since the end of the Civil War, we have had, change of regimes twice, and the COVID crisis, and then even finally when Sri Lanka defaulted in April 2022. But if you look at the policy timeline, in 2007 was when we first floated our sovereign bond. There have been 2 subsequent IMF agreements. So we've been under the watch of the IMF. In July 2009, soon after the war ended, there was an IMF agreement. Then again in 2016, another IMF agreement. But as the situation escalated, what is interesting is that by December 2021, so we default in April 2022, by December 2021, there's rising calls from the neoliberal think tanks, from the opposition, that Sri Lanka should default and go to the IMF, right? And so it's interesting how that came about. And then by March, and even though now, the president's advisors, everybody would say that, the IMF agreement comes much later. I mean, the staff agreement in September, the IMF agreement in September 2022, and then the executive board approval in March 2023. But in reality, if you look at the Article 4 consultation report, which was in December 2021, 5 months before, and in March itself, we go to a floating exchange rate, the interest rates are hiked up, the central bank policy rate from 6% to 16.5%. So this huge, and then of course the increase in the value added tax. So the huge contraction, how much of it was the default and how much of it was these sort of prior conditions that were being implemented based on the IMF's recommendations is something to think about. The IMF program itself, it's a 48-month extended fund facility for just $3 billion US. I mean, I think all of us see everywhere they call it a bailout, but it's really peanuts if you look at the amount, right? Every month, so Sri Lanka's, if you divide that by 48, it's $60 million US. But every month, Sri Lanka's foreign earnings, even today, that's how we are surviving, is $1.8 billion US, 30 times that amount. So there's no bailout, but in terms of the conditions and the sort of force with which debt restructuring and the conditions are being implemented, it's been quite devastating. And the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. So, I mean, over the last 2 years, Sri Lanka doesn't have any economic policies. It's almost as if Colombo is on autopilot. If you look at the IMF's structural benchmarks and the World Bank country partnership framework, that's all that we're implementing. What the government is doing more is repression and all kinds of laws also that the IMF and the World Bank have demanded, even though it's a parliament that has no legitimacy. You would have seen the huge protests where the president ran away, but those are being implemented. So in terms of the implicit conditionalities, already there was a number of them that were in the, as I mentioned, the article. These are the recommendations that have always been there, right? Then they start implementing all of this well ahead of the IMF program itself. And in terms of the explicit conditionalities, the major ones I would say are that, a primary budget surplus of 2.3%, when, it's virtually, so government spending is coming down to zero in the process, but that we have to show progress with debt restructuring. You would have seen that Sri Lanka is on the verge of, with the private creditors, but something like hugely unfavorable to Sri Lanka, but the IMF is congratulating Sri Lanka on the progress that it has made. And then many of the same benchmarks I think you would see not only in Sri Lanka, which has been there over the last couple of decades, but in so many other countries as well. So in terms of debt restructuring, the IMF's DSA, after the debt restructuring, we are still going to end up with 95% in public debt. The IMF DSA itself says that the next shock can, push us back into default. It's the first time we've defaulted, but again. They have a sort of external debt servicing target of 4.5% of GDP, which according to, if you go with the IMF's targets, that would amount to about 30% of expected revenue. So we've increased the value-added tax from 8% to 18%. Pretty much all of that would just go towards debt servicing, just the external debt servicing part. Or there's this huge push that, okay, the way forward is through export-led growth, but 30% of that export growth would be towards debt servicing. And combined with this, Sri Lanka did implement domestic debt restructuring, and according to my calculations, over the next 16 years, and these are people who earn, most of them, below poverty level wages, tea pluckers on plantations, government sector workers. The opportunity cost with this is something like a 40% decline in their retirement funds. And the end goal of all of this is a return to commercial borrowing by 2027, right? So we are going through all this process. So when the IMF program ends, we would end up being ready to float a $1.5 billion US ISB in 2027, another $1.5 billion US ISB in 2028. So it's in that sense, so I'll get to the second part of what I want to emphasize and reflecting on a lot of the really interesting presentations over the last 2 days. I would say when you're thinking in terms of this explicit or implicit conditionalities, I want to almost think in terms of a implicit logic of financialization, right? And financialization as a class project, right? It's because I think one thing, maybe a little bit more emphasis needed in this room as well, is what are the domestic or what are the ruling regimes in these countries doing, right? It's if you take Sri Lanka, they're very much in line with what the IMF wants to do, right? So there's a class project that benefits creditors, but also the local elite. That was the call for default and going to the IMF program. I mean, the logic of the implicit and explicit conditionalities, we see the double standards. There's one thing that the managing director of the IMF says in Washington. On the ground, it's sometimes almost the very opposite. But there is, underneath it, I would say, a class logic. And with that, we went and saw Bandes, we're talking about development banks. And this is a long-term logic at work in terms of finance and financialization. Sri Lanka had two development banks, the National Development Bank and the Development Financing Corporation of Ceylon. And in the 1990s, when we went through another one of those IMF programs, it was pressured, so we commercialized and privatized both development banks. So we don't have any more domestic development banks. With this particular crisis, while they did not touch the banking sector with domestic debt restructuring, what they did was they need to capitalize them, but they also, the two biggest banks, the Bank of Ceylon and the People's Bank, they've started the process of privatization. So they have to divest 20% of their shares. So what is, even though you would remember the World Bank came out and said during COVID that it is the state banks, particularly in South Asia, they came out with the report. So the state banks, that the ones that were very supportive of small businesses when the private banks wouldn't lend at all. But now that process, so this long process of privatizing finance and banking. The second point is that all these policies are, for me, deflationary, right? In the interest of this sort of class project. So I think yesterday also the question of inflation came up. We knew that it was a one-time inflation because of the devaluation of the rupee from 200 to 360 in March 2022, right? But then they slammed it with a 10.5% increase in interest rates and also the commodity price increases, knowing that year on year it was going to come down anyway. And that's what led to the huge contraction. But that contraction in turn makes it favorable for the creditors. So the way in which, again, the logic of financialization towards the interests of the financier classes. Second, when you look at taxes, there was some push. There was questions about the need for a wealth tax, about redistribution, but that's been on hold. Everything else is urgent for the IMF program, but when it comes to the wealth taxes, the IMF says, well, they need to get the administrative structures in order to be able to do that. And then, of course, tremendous wage repression towards this kind of export-led growth. In the IMF program, continuously, the call for trade liberalization amidst this crisis. Yesterday, Professor Patnaik was talking about foreign exchange rationing, as that's the last thing they want to see, right? And this whole contraction that I mentioned, if you look at what's actually happened, and market pricing of fuel has led to fuel usage in Sri Lanka now over the last year dropping by 40%, right? The use of petrol and diesel, that's the kind of contraction. And last week, the IMF staff completed their visit to Sri Lanka, and they came out and said that they welcome removing the import restrictions on vehicles and vehicle imports. So people can't afford fuel, people can't afford even public transport, but they're welcoming vehicle imports. So So that's again how the kind of class project is working. At the end of it, as I mentioned, it's back towards all of this. So this whole austerity, the debt restructuring process, so that again, we can go back to the capital markets. And so this logic of financialization from the time of privatizing the development banks, that's the march forward. And my question is, and I'll leave it as a question, how do we reverse that process? Is it possible to reverse that process? And what would, I think Professor Jan Kregel mentioned yesterday this idea of self-sufficiency. What would self-sufficiency mean? What are we having development financing for? And what kind of development financing would lead to self-sufficiency, right? Like Alfredo mentioned, we need growth, but growth with redistribution. What kind of growth are we looking at? What kind of economy are we going to look at? And what would development financing, if it is to come from outside, look like that would support that? Big is not better. And I'll leave with that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahilan. So we have about 15 minutes for the Q&A session. If you'd like to ask a question, share a comment, please raise your hands. We will share a mic. Please state your name and your institution, and try to be brief because we only have 15 minutes and we'd like the speakers to answer your questions. I see we have one on the front, number 1 to 3. So we have the first one. Yeah, the mic is coming.
Okay, thank you for the presentations. I will do a quick question for each one of the speaker. I will begin with Alfredo. Do you think there is, you mentioned the Washington Consensus in our presentation, and I'd like to hear if you believe there is a Beijing Consensus, that it would be differ from the Washington Consensus. I'd like to hear you about this. As for Marina, you mentioned that the problem of the Kenya is not about exactly the fiscal problem, but the balance of payment problem, restriction. And if I understood correctly, it seems that the fiscal problem is related to balance of payments, restriction. And I'd like to hear from you as well, how is the structure of the public debt of the Kenya? That is, it seems that it's denominated in foreign currency. This is important to understand the nature of the crisis. Okay, I'd like to hear, because you mentioned about the thin fiscal space and so on. I'd like to hear you. And Ahilan, I just like to hear you mention about a lot of time about financialization. What is the concept of financialization that you are using in order to understand the link that you are doing with the Sri Lanka crisis? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. There's the gentleman just next to you, and then don't go in the back. Just next to you. And please state your name and your institution.
Yes, I'm Martin Guzman from Columbia University. Thank you for the insightful presentations. I think we learned a lot from them. The first one is for Marina. Marina, you described a situation that is common to many countries. We were discussing yesterday the situation in which after the 2008 financial crisis in the US, there was an increase in global liquidity and several countries, many countries actually borrow, and they were not ready for it, and now they can't refinance the debts, they can't pay the debts. There is a development crisis, and you referred to Kenya. And I have a few questions referred to your presentation. First, you distinguished refinancing from relief, but why can't refinancing entail relief if the extension of maturities are sufficiently long and the interest rates at which the debts are refinanced are much lower than the contractual rates under the current bonds? Part of the problem is that these interest rates are very high. So are you assessing that the debt stocks are such that even at a low interest rate and a reasonable growth rate of output, the countries wouldn't be able to sustain those debts in the future. The second question refers to the role of the international financial institutions. You described that there is a current account problem, a current account imbalance. And if, when we have a current account imbalance, if there is no external financing, the country is forced to adjust. That's basic math, right? So if you don't have financing for sustaining a negative current account, it has to be zero. If the capital account is zero, the current account is going to be zero, except if you can deplete your reserves. So the part that I didn't quite understand is what role you give to international financial institutions here. Are you promoting more financing to avoid a short-term adjustment in the current account? And if that's the case, why do we think it would, why would it make sense to make the IMF bigger if the IMF is the same institution that is pushing for privatization of companies that work well, other conditionalities that actually damage the productive capacity of the countries that are in distress? And I won't say anything about Sri Lanka, but I thank you for the presentation, and I'm sorry about what's going on.
Thank you very much. Dongo, I don't see any other hands. So, we have one last one, and then we'll go back to the speakers. Oh, well, we'll take the two, Dongo and then the two colleagues.
Dongo Sila from IDEAS. Thanks to the panelists for the brilliant presentations. I have one question to Marina about the relationships between the external financial flows and the current account. In the case of current account deficits, in the case of Kenya, I have the feeling that, in fact, it's the external flows that sustain the current account deficits, and not that the current account deficits, in fact, induce the need to attract foreign, let's say, foreign investment, foreign flows. I think that if you look at, for example, the data, you could see that between 2010 and 2020, the stock of foreign direct investment in Kenya was multiplied by 2. And public foreign debt stock was also multiplied by 4. And this sustained the current account deficit. But the thing is, during this period, there had not been a growth of the export, because also the currency was overvalued. So this is, I think, a structural problem for all countries that rely on foreign finance to try to industrialize. You said industrial policy. Yes, but industrial policy will also run into the same problem, because generally industrial policy is foreign exchange intensive. So I think one structural measure should be that, well, these countries need to have access to the capital goods, equipments they need in their domestic currency. Otherwise, there is no way that they could escape recurrent debt crisis.
Thank you. And then the two last colleagues.
Thank you so much for the great presentations. My name is Devika. I'm at King's College London. Ahilan, that was a really great presentation. I'm very glad that you put it in terms of that this is kind of a class project, and I guess about the domestic political economy in Sri Lanka, and basically that this, of course, there's a structural crisis, but that's often an excuse to impose these policies in interest of a certain a class project. And so I really like that framing, and I'm wondering, like, if you think about it in that way, what, in your view, are sort of avenues for resistance and change, given this massive constraint that they're in? And I know that there are lots of Sri Lankan organizations that are organizing for it. So if you could speak to a bit about that, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. I have two main questions. One has to do with inflation. I think the first and the third speakers talked about it. So I really like how you criticize this idea of interest rate hikes would be helpful for inflation, reduction, because what we are often told is that when you higher interest rate, you can help to, support your currency value, and that would then help to, reduce inflation. But I really like the way you frame it. This is a class project. It is to benefit the creditors at the expense of the national economy, especially the people, not the elites. So that's a comment. But then the question that I have is, I heard somewhere in the first presenter that you mentioned the number of 40% inflation rate. You say anything that is below that, it seemed to be comfortable. And I heard this from many different places, but I just wanted to, kind of hope that you can elaborate a little bit more on that magic, 40%. And then the second question, it's, I think, not exactly addressed, but I would like to, again, get a bit more insights from the speakers as you're doing this country-based studies, because we were told just a moment ago that BRI is a total failure in Latin American countries. And we know that BRI, looms large in countries like Kenya, with the standard gauge railways, and then in Sri Lanka with the Hambantota port. So I'm wondering, what role China's investment or finance has in terms of the debt and also in terms of, the debt resolution, so to speak, because obviously, there are always comments that it's because of China. China is the bad guy here, creates a debt crisis. Others that, China did not create it, but does need to play a role. So I just wanted to know what your takes are. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for these great questions. We have a lot to tackle, and we don't have many minutes left. So perhaps each speaker can take 5 to 7 minutes, so that we can try to stay on time.
So Beijing consensus, as opposed to Washington consensus, I don't think there is such a thing. I'm not convinced that China was serious about that. I think the Chinese, is that American idea not? Then you should answer this question, and I would benefit enormously from that. What I was going to say, and it is clearly incorrect by now, is that I think the Chinese government has a sincere avoidance at preaching to developing countries and want to establish relationships that are much more even, much more equal than those that are dominant across or with Western economies. But I'll defer to Jomo on this one, and I would like to hear the proper answer. Couple of comments on other things. Many developing countries have unsustainable current accounts, and that is colonial or inheritance of colonial economic structures. If you want to pursue integration, I think the success cases, take Ethiopia and Vietnam as good examples, in my view. Integration is through, or should be through, trade, not finance, definitely not through debt. It should be through or driven by exports, not driven by imports. That would minimize the involvement of the country with international financial institutions, and that is important to avoid. It is important to avoid situations of external vulnerability, accumulation of debt, etc., because you will lose control. Once you go to these to the IFIs, you have lost control over policy making. Your policy space is dramatically reduced, and you are locked in. So it is very important, I think, to avoid the buildup of vulnerabilities. And in that sense, important to reduce the size of the IMF and the World Bank as part of a project of definancialization of the global economy. So no additional growth for them. Let's reduce the need for their existence over time. On inflation and interest rate, that's the 40% is a correlation. That's empirical work going all over the place there. But some of the work that I have seen, and I'm happy to share references, shows some regularity at the level of 40%. Until about 40% inflation, no adverse implication for growth. When it rises a lot above that, then you start to have a negative correlation. But then what is it that is driving? And that is not clear immediately. In the conventional discourse, there's a lot of insistence that any amount of inflation, maybe above 2%, becomes a problem for growth. That is emphatically not true. And that any amount of inflation is particularly bad for the poor because the poor keep more of their assets in the form of cash, and cash is eroded by inflation. That's also not true. Inflation is bad for finance. That is why financiers are absolutely obsessed about keeping inflation extraordinarily low, because it gives stability to nominal values of financial assets. They are the ones who win from obsessive strategies of low inflation, and they don't care about unemployment either, because they are not involved, they are not deprived of anything when unemployment is high, and their financial assets are safer. So, no, I think we need a more accommodating set of monetary policies with a view to, while maintaining domestic equilibrium within a rapid growth project that can be inspired by success cases like, as I mentioned, Ethiopia and Vietnam. But that would be a longer conversation. I still want your answer at some point.
Okay. So we go in the order. Okay, thank you for the question. So first, Luis, yeah, you're completely right. I think, of course, there is the relationship between the fiscal policies and the balance of payment policies. I'm not saying they are unconnected, but I think we need to distinguish from two things. First, especially in developing countries, it's important that the government has a deficit to promote development, especially, with counter-cyclical approach. I think there is a symmetry of policy in the sense that, okay, fiscal policy deficit can generate a current account deficit because, we are going to increase the import ratio, so on and so forth. But it doesn't mean that if you need to correct the current account deficit, that then you need to do fiscal austerity. I think there is an asymmetry of policies that we need to take into consideration. In the debt structure of Kenya, about 2/3 of the government debt is hard currency, which complicates, but they are having a lot of non-residents in local currency. And as the non-residents are not interested anymore in holding local currency debt, they started to financing more expensively domestically, which also make the situation even worse. And now there is a discussion that you cannot monetize your debt. How do we do if you don't have residents interested, non-resident interested? What do you do? There is no much way out. But yeah, so this is one point. On Martin's question, first, I think the huge question of refinancing or not is if it's net present value neutral. Net present value neutral. My understanding from the perspective of the US is that it's not going to have a reduction of the net present value. So if there is no reduction, I think it's going to just kick down the problem, have a problem within a few years. I think that is having haircut or extending the maturity, they can be equal, but then we need to talk about reducing interest rate in the long run. You can have, maturity needs to do 10, 15 years. Then it can be the same as reducing the haircut now. But the discussion that we're having now is that it has to be net present value neutral. Then it's not a solution. I think the key question is we need money to financing the gross external financial needs. It can be financed by the old money, which would be the debt relief, or it can be financing by the new money that we also needed. If you just refinancing the old money, you're actually not creating, additional resources to pay your gross external financial needs. But we can discuss more. I think it's quite technical. We can discuss more about this later. On the IMF being bigger, my vision and looking to Kinderberg, to Minsky, we need a bigger bank and a big government. And this is true domestically to do counter-cyclical policies, but it's also true internationally. If you have an economy that is naturally, cyclical, we need an institution that stabilizes the country, the situation. Should be a better IMF. There is a lot of discussion who should substitute the IMF. Now you have regional financial arrangements, you have swaps. The truth is, most countries, they have no option but the IMF. So Chinese swaps, they are great. Fed swaps, they are great. But they don't reach low-income countries. Regional financial arrangements, there is no regional financial arrangements in Africa. Where should they run to? So I think there is an effort to seriously make the IMF better, but then they also need more resources. I don't agree that this IMF as it now should be bigger, but we need a better and then a bigger. I think that's my main my main argument. On Dongo, I agree. I think that we also need to differentiate the short and the long term. And when you do industrial policy, the short run, you're going to have more pressure on your balance of payments. But if you do an export-led on the long run, maybe you need, maybe it's going to stabilize. But I think this highlights the fact that, development model requires external financing at some point. And then it goes to the fact that you need more ODA, you need more, discuss the prices system, right? Why cocoa or coffee needs to be the price as it now should be higher. This will be helping developing countries to have an external balance. Finally, on China, on the Belt and Road Initiative and China and Africa, in case of Kenya, in the Article 4 of the IMF for 2018, if I'm not mistaken, there is a footnote talking about the investments of China in Kenya. And basically, the IMF shows that the railway, which was financed by China, it was, the project itself was paying itself. So it was a model that, the production of the fees of the railway would pay the project, and also they had a fee in the exports. So actually, it was a project that would pay itself. And this is, I think, adds to, for instance, for the asks for China for not restructured projects that are self-sustained, right? So there have been these requests. I think it's politically challenging, but there have been requests to not restructuring projects that are self-sustained, basically. And some of the projects in Africa, highways, energy projects, they are self-sustained. They are debt, but they are self-sustained projects. Yeah, but happy to chat more later. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I think I have 3 questions. First on financialization. I mean, I see it as more of a historical process that once there was capital account convertibility, then the private banks started to expand. And then if you look at, along with, even as you were floating sovereign bonds and that process accelerated, we saw it at the rural level as well. That's when microfinance. So before Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt in 2022, about 6 years earlier, we were in a very deep microfinance-led rural indebtedness crisis. I mean, it goes back to, I think, yesterday afternoon's panel, how, when you try to accumulate through finance and the kind of dynamic that it creates, it leads to Ponzi finance, so financial instability in the way in which Minsky says, but it's also a very, very accelerated form of extraction that happens at both levels, right? So that's why also reversing it is so difficult because, I mean, if you look at Sri Lanka's class structure, it's changed in the last 15 years too, where the financier classes, these are the new guys who have suddenly come up in power, right? And they are the ones, so it works at many different levels, but I would put the emphasis on, the kind of Ponzi schemes that it can create and the kind of instability that it can create, but also the high level of extraction all the way down to the rural level, at every level that it can extract. On sort of alternatives to the kind of current path, I mean, if you look at what's happening, the entire focus, I think this is what I mean by alternatives also. Of course, we need debt relief, debt restructuring, but also what kind of policies can the state take forward? If, to some extent, yeah, the fiscal space is also shrinking, but then there are blinders, right? So for example, if you look at it, we are not only in a deep debt crisis, we are also facing a food crisis, right? And the whole question of the land question has to be brought back now, right? That is one resource that the state has, which they can't say they don't have, right? If they want to have land distribution, redistribution, or if they want to have land alienation, that is something the state can do, even if they claim they don't have the fiscal space. So, and if you look at historically, where would that kind of more productive accumulation happen? I would say even in Sri Lanka today, would be through land distribution, but redistribution, and that's not happening. So we have to kind of start to, when I say that the importance of thinking about self-sufficiency, we need to start thinking about those questions seriously as well. On China and the Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, you would have seen in the Western media this huge projection of Sri Lanka having been caught in this Chinese debt trap. I don't agree with that. If you look at even our external debt stock, I mean, in fact, I've been writing and saying Sri Lanka is in an IMF trap, right? And then the IMF trap was this call for default and go to the IMF program. And now that you have defaulted and you're in an IMF program, you can't come out of the IMF program because the IMF is the arbiter of the debt restructuring process. So we are in a kind of an IMF trap, and the whole question has been, okay, how do you renegotiate, or how do you leave this IMF program in a way that it's sustainable, and our policymakers are having difficulty thinking through that part. So we really are in an IMF trap. On the other hand, whether it comes to, if you look at this whole emphasis on infrastructure investment over the last 15 years, how much of it has provided return? So this goes back to the question of what kind of investment, what kind of growth, and is it growth with redistribution? So all these, or growth with inequality or not. So all these questions come up. And when it comes to that, and even now with the crisis, again, even before the debt has been fully restructured, there's already Chinese investment coming, so is Indian investment coming. For me, neither of it, and as part of Quad, the Australians are going to come in. So it's everybody, but it's like the vultures are hovering over Sri Lanka when it's its most vulnerable stage. And for me, nothing is going to come good out of any of this kind of investment until, and I think this is a question for countries like Sri Lanka, until we decide what development path we want to take forward, rather than just looking for any project that is pushed down on us. So that kind of question, I think it goes back to the question of, okay, so if it's this huge asymmetry of power between a country like Sri Lanka, and not just China, but India or any other big power, versus this idea, I think yesterday was floated, the idea of a union of small states, whether that kind of architecture would be better serve countries like Sri Lanka is something to think about. Thank you.
Very quickly, something. Okay, very quickly, I noted here and I didn't say, still on the fiscal part, I don't want to imply that, there is no way that Kenya fiscal situation should be better. I'm not saying this. I know the tax revenue to GDP is very low, but the thing is, if you want to adjust this, it's going to take time. You need, solve the illicit financial flows in Africa. We need international cooperation. You need to tax the rich. You are not going to do this in 1 week. It's something that will take time to build, and we need to take into account the path. Yeah, just adding this.
Thank you very much for our speakers, for their great presentation and for the questions as well. I will give the mic back to our host, but I believe that we are going on lunch break. So enjoy your lunch, and I'll see you later. Thank you.